When it comes to medieval peasants, many people envision a life of absolute misery, constant hunger, filth, exhausting labor, and unending exploitation. But is this perception accurate? In this video, I'll demonstrate that reality was more nuanced than stereotypes suggest. It wasn't as dire as some believe, nor as idealized as portrayed in certain films. Peasants worked hard, no doubt, but their daily lives varied a lot depending on where they lived. Those in small villages had a different routine from those in larger cities. And here's a surprising fact. They had around 4 months off throughout the year. Sounds like a dream, right? But hold on, it wasn't as great as it sounds. That break happened because the work was seasonal, meaning peasants had to plant and harvest at the right times to secure food for the winter. There were also religious holidays that gave them time off. But that didn't mean life was peaceful. The average life expectancy of a peasant was low, around 30 to 40 years, and disease, war, and famine were constant threats. Even while resting, peasants had to worry about rationing food for winter and dealing with possible attacks or sudden taxes. The rest was well earned, but life was far from easy. Another important point is that despite the hard work, peasants didn't spend the entire day in the fields. In fact, many worked fewer hours per day than a modern factory worker. But that didn't make it easy. The tasks were physically demanding, and even a simple cut could be fatal due to infection and the lack of effective medical treatment. Medieval medicine was very basic, and treatments ranged from prayers and herbal remedies to questionable methods that often made things worse. While the rich had access to more educated doctors and slightly better resources, peasants had to rely on their own bodies and natural resilience to survive illnesses. Contrary to what some may think, peasants didn't live on scraps or rotten meat. Their diet was relatively healthy, based on grains, vegetables, fruits, and meat when it was available. Of course, times of famine could happen, especially in years of poor harvest. Hygiene wasn't completely absent either. In small villages with access to rivers or water sources, peasants could bathe regularly. In large cities, however, the situation was much worse. Basic sanitation was nearly non-existent, and the lack of cleanliness helped spread disease. Where a peasant lived made all the difference. In small villages, they could access land lent by the feudal lord and lived in a less contaminated environment. However, they might suffer from a lack of resources or enemy invasions if the local lord didn't have a strong army. In bigger cities, the opportunities were different. For someone talented as a merchant or craftsman, urban life offered more chances to become wealthy. But for the average peasant, the struggles were intense. Trouble paying rent, finding food, and dealing with filth and disease. Although many believe the Middle Ages were lawless, there actually was a justice system. The feudal lord had a duty to protect his people and maintain order, since revolts and dissatisfaction could threaten his power. As we've seen, peasant life wasn't a never-ending nightmare or a fairy tale either. It heavily depended on where and how they lived. They faced major hardships like lack of access to medicine and constant threat of hunger, but also had a few advantages, such as rest periods and a decent diet. The Middle Ages were full of contrasts, and peasant life was a clear reflection of that.